Gideon Hale came to Juniper Street expecting an empty workshop and a routine property inspection. Instead, he found apprentices working, neighbors sheltering from the cold, and a young craftswoman repairing a cracked metal tray beneath a yellow lamp. Then the necklace slipped from beneath her sweatshirt. Gideon recognized its copper and silver oval. He had made that imperfect seam 20 years earlier, while helping his former wife, Celeste,
Mr. Hale?
finish the only necklace she never allowed Northglass to sell. It should have disappeared with her after their marriage ended. When Amara finally looked up, she did not seem surprised to see him.
You're early.
She turned the necklace over and revealed the old repair.
That necklace.
Celeste had given it to her for a reason, and she had expected Gideon to recognize exactly where the metal had once broken.
Celeste gave it to me. She said you'd recognize the solder.
To understand why, we begin at Juniper Street. Gideon Hale saw the necklaces before he saw the woman wearing it. A copper and silver ovals slipped from beneath her sweatshirt as she bent over a cracked serving tray. It swung beneath the work lamp, exposing a crooked clasp and a pale curve of solder across the back. Gideon stopped halfway through removing his gloves. 20 years had passed since he last held that piece, but time could not invent that seam. He had made it on a wet November night when he and Celeste were too tired to rebuild the clasp and too proud to admit it leaned left. Mr. Hale, his acquisitions director said. Gideon did not answer. The young woman had not noticed him. Short twists were tucked beneath a charcoal cap, and her work jacket was dark at the cuffs. She guided a fine file along the tray's repaired edge, paused, then tested it with her thumb. She was not making the old metal look new. She was making it useful again. Juniper Street Metalworks stood between a closed laundromat and a bus depot. Northglass had an option to buy the block. Gideon expected bare rooms and a contractor's estimate. Instead, the workshop was full. Apprentices sorted donated fixtures, while an older man warmed his hands beside a radiator. Wet coats hung beneath a sign offering daytime shelter during freezing weather. This space was supposed to be cleared, the director said. The craftswoman lifted the tray. The necklace settles against her collarbone. Celeste had drawn that oval on a grocery receipt when she and Gideon lived above his mother's alteration shop. She cut it from scrap because they could not afford new metal. Celeste called it practice. Gideon told her it looked like the beginning of a company. She wore it when Northglass signed its first lease. As far as Gideon knew, she wore it. For the last time the morning, she packed 3 boxes and left their apartment. It had never appeared in their property settlement. Gideon told himself that was because it belonged to Celeste. She designed it, shaped it, and built its clasp. His only contribution was the flawed solder line now resting against stranger's skin. The file stopped. The young woman looked from his face to the Northglass pin on his coat. She set the tray down and swept the filings into a neat pile. "You're early," she said. "You knew I was coming? I knew Northglass was coming. I didn't know the CEO needed to inspect the walls himself." The director opened his folder. "We're confirming the property's condition. It leaks above the east stairs," she replied. "The rear window sticks, and the ventilation belt needs a part that's 6 weeks late. If you want the condition, ask the people who work here." There was no anger in her voice, only precision. Gideon studied her bench. Calipers, abrasive cloth, padded clamps, and repaired hinges sat within easy reach. A tool case was tucked below it beside a dark overnight bag. He did not know the bag held most of what Amara Ellis owned. Her apartment had been condemned 7 weeks earlier. The residence where she slept required everyone to leave by 8 each morning, so she arrived before the radiators warmed. She never asked for easier work. At that moment, Gideon knew only that she possessed something Celeste had guarded carefully. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amara." He stepped forward, then stopped at the edge of her work area. "That necklace." Amara raised one hand, not to hide the oval, but to hold it still. Her expression barely changed, yet Gideon understood that his arrival had not surprised her. "Celeste gave it to me," she said. Amara turned the necklace over between two fingers and showed him the pale, uneven line. She said, "If you ever came through that door, you'd recognize the solders." Gideon kept his eyes on the solder line. "Where did you find it?" Amara's fingers closed around the necklace. The question sounded reasonable until it settled between them. Gideon heard what he had implied, but not before she did. "Found it?" she repeated. "I meant, where did Celeste give it to you?" "No." "You meant what you asked." The acquisitions director shifted beside him. Amara studied Gideon's expensive coat, polished shoes, and company pin. "You saw something you thought was missing," she said. "Then you saw me and chose the word found. That wasn't my intention." "Intentions don't change the question." Her voice never rose. That made the mistake harder to hide behind. "When did you last speak to Celeste?" he asked. "Recently. Is she all right?" "That depends on what you mean by all right." Each answer drew a boundary. Amara gave him facts without giving him access. "May I examine the necklace?" "No." Gideon nodded. "Then may I look more closely?" Amara considered the difference and pointed to a worn leather pad on her bench. "You can look here. It doesn't leave this table." She placed the oval on the pad, keeping one hand beside it. Fine scratches crossed the copper, and a clean silver repair interrupted the aged bezel. "You repaired it," Gideon said. The bezel split at the lower curve. Someone overheated an older repair, so the metal became brittle beside the joint. He looked at the solder seam he had made 20 years ago. "Was that someone me?" Amara almost smiled. "Not unless you repaired it twice." She set a magnifying lens beside the necklace rather than handing it to him. "The pale seam is older. The damage came later. I stabilized the split, but I didn't polish the repair into the surrounding metal." "Why not?" "Because conspiration's thing isn't pretending nothing happened." Through the lens, Gideon saw a rectangular stamp beneath the clasp. Northglass had used that mark for internal inventory during its early years, an angular N followed by a 4-digit code. "This was cataloged," he said. "It was stamped," Amara corrected. "That doesn't tell us who made it." She adjusted the lamp. A second mark appeared beneath the inventory stamp, smaller and older. Oxidation almost concealed 2 fine letters inside an unfinished circle. "CV Celeste mark," Gideon whispered. "You recognize it. She used it before Northglass had a logo." "I found the lower curve while cleaning corrosion from the cracked bezel," Amara said. "This asked me to stop as soon as I could document both layers." "Document them for what?" That's a question for her. The director set Gideon's briefcase on a nearby table. It tipped against a clamp and opened, sending papers onto the floor. A glossy booklet landed face up between Gideon's shoes. Northglass, the origin concoction. The anniversary launch was 6 days away. Gideon had approved every story beneath its designs. In the conference room, the enlarged renderings had seemed modern and unfamiliar. Besides Celeste's necklace, there was nowhere for polished language to hide the resemblance. The cover showed the same copper and silver oval. The left-leaning clasp had become a decorative flourish. Even the narrow break in Celeste's unfinished circle appeared in the collection's emblem. Amara picked up the booklet. For the first time, her composure gave way to surprise. She placed the cover beside the necklace and aligned their lower curves. They copied it. Gideon stared at the line printed beneath the photograph, drawn from the private archive of Northglass founder Gideon Hale. "No," he said. Gideon could no longer tell whether he was denying the design, the credit line, or the signature with which he had approved both. Amara slid the booklet across the bench. "Then you'd better decide what you are denying." Gideon looked from Celeste's necklace to the booklet. "I didn't design those pieces." "But your name is under them," Amara said. "The collection team called it an interpretation of our early archive. The word held him still." Gideon sent the acquisitions director outside. Celeste knew about the launch, he asked. She knew enough to send you the necklace. In 1998, Gideon and Celeste worked at a scarred kitchen table. Celeste drew forms on grocery receipts and cut them from cheap metal. Gideon kept invoices in a shoebox and called shop owners during lunch breaks. The division had once felt honest. Celeste made the objects. Gideon found people willing to buy them. Their first catalog named her beneath every photograph. Celeste Vaughn, metalsmith and designer. When orders increased, Gideon hired assistants and persuaded Celeste to present their pieces as one collection. Buyers preferred a single identity, he explained. Northglass sounded larger than two exhausted people eating beside a polishing wheel. Celeste agreed to the company name. She never agreed that the company had invented her hands, yet her credit moved to the catalog's last page. Later it became Creative Direction, Northglass Studio. By the 5th anniversary, her designs were described only as the Founder Archive. Gideon approved every change. None looked like erasure alone. Each arrived beside a deadline, printing cost, or investor request. Celeste objected. Gideon promised to correct the next edition. The next edition repeated the same words. His memory preserved their separation as fair, because both had supposedly left with what they wanted. The booklet made that memory difficult to keep. Why is her mark beneath the inventory stamp? Amara asked. Northglass had cataloged its prototypes before moving into its first warehouse. An insurer required permanent identification, so Gideon authorized workers to stamp every archived piece over one weekend. Celeste returned from teaching and found company codes struck across dozens of objects. You stamped Northglass over the makers, she had told him. It's an inventory number. It's on top of my mark. We'll place the others differently. You already did the others. Gideon believed she was arguing about placement. He ordered future codes moved to the edge and considered the problem solved. Now the company's stamp appeared deeper and larger than the initials beneath it. Anyone searching quickly would notice Glass and Miss Celeste. Did you tell them to cover it? Amara asked. No, but I ordered the stamping and never checked their work. That matters, she said. It just doesn't repair anything. Gideon opened the booklet. Its introduction described him as the creative force behind Northglass's foundational language. He had not written the sentence, but his approval initials appeared below it. During Celeste's final year, she spent fewer hours at the main studio and more time teaching. They communicated through assistants because direct conversations became arguments. Gideon told himself she was stepping away from work they had built together. He never asked whether the work had been taken away from her. When their marriage ended, lawyers divided property, shares, royalties, and rights. Gideon signed hundreds of pages. His attorney tapped one section and called it routine protection for the Founder Archive. Gideon signed without reading it closely. The phrase sounded like a way to keep old prototypes together. Now he remembered the clause reaching further. Sketches, production cards, unreleased designs, and every derivative work based upon them. The Origin collection had been enabled by a signature Gideon placed 20 years earlier, then forgot because forgetting cost him nothing. Amara watched his face. What did you sign? Gideon opened his eyes. The answer no longer belonged safely in the past. Something I should have read. Amara returned the necklace to its chain. If you want to know what you signed, the answer isn't in that booklet. She led Gideon to a steel cabinet beside a dehumidifier. You keep an archive here. Celeste does. I help maintain it. Amara carried a flat box to a clean table and handed Gideon gloves. Inside lay production cards, photographs, receipts, and sketches. Every item contained a date, material source, or note connecting it to the next. The necklace has 3 solder layers, she explained. The oldest matches this production card. Your pale repair came later. Mine is documented with photographs. Gideon read the card. Oval studi copper, silver, brass. See Euphin. It was dated 9 months before Northglass officially existed. How can you verify it wasn't written later? You don't verify provenance with one object. A supplier's receipt matched the card and the batch number of the brass clasps. Oxidation proved Celeste's mark existed before the Northglass stamp. A photograph showed the necklace on Gideon's old kitchen table. You compare solder, materials, handwriting, photographs, and tool marks, Amara said. None proves authorship alone. Together, they form a chain. The next photograph showed the necklace beside an early Northglass wall fixture bearing the same unfinished circle. Celeste stood behind them with a file. The picture predated the company's claimed creation date by 4 months. Northglass's anniversary exhibition identified the fixture as Gideon's first original design. I sold it, Gideon said. Celeste made the prototype. I found the buyer. Your archive says otherwise. My archive, he repeated. Gideon asked the acquisitions director for the property survey. Its first page classified Juniper Street Metalworks as vacant industrial space. This says there are no active occupants. The surveyor came on a Sunday, Amara said. We're closed Sundays. She indicated a calendar of training, repairs, and warming center hours. 23 people use these benches each week. The city sends residents here during extreme cold. No one asked us. The acquisition summary said demolition would not affect community services. Gideon's initials appeared beneath it. He had approved it 3 days earlier. The pattern was no longer confined to a necklace. Consultant reduced a working shop to vacant space. A marketing team reduced Celeste's designs to a founder archive. Gideon accepted both summaries and signed where someone placed a tab. Amara closed the box. You're wondering whether these records can stop the purchase. I'm wondering how many people reviewed my files without entering this building. That's a better question. May I have copies? You may request them from Celeste. The originals stay here. Then let me speak to her. I messaged her when you arrived. And she said to show you the first box. Nothing else until she comes. When will that be? Amara removed a final photograph from beneath her report. It showed Celeste at the kitchen table beside the unfinished necklace and wall fixture. A newspaper displayed a date nearly a year before Northglass legally existed. On the back, Celeste had written, 2 designs completed. Gideon meeting buyer Tuesday. Gideon recognized her handwriting and his sales folder at the image's edge. Northglass had preserved pictures of him presenting the finished fixture, but not this one showing its maker. When did Celeste find these? She never lost them. Makers keep production records. Northglass lost her name because that was convenient. Gideon looked from the occupied benches to the survey, calling them empty. What does she want me to correct first? Amara's expression shifted. It was the first question that placed responsibility on him. Before she could answer, headlights crossed the rain-streaked windows. A dark blue car stopped outside. Amara returned the photograph to its sleeve. You can ask her yourself. The workshop door opened with a gust of rain. Celeste Vaughn entered in navy coveralls beneath a wet coat. Her eyes found Amara first. Did he handle the originals? With gloves. Only the first box. After checking the archive sleeve, she faced Gideon. Celeste. Gideon. You saw the collection booklet and property survey, she asked. Yes. Then we don't need to prove you were given incomplete information. Why didn't you call me? I did 20 years ago. You sent my questions to counsel. Now I needed a record before a conversation. He glanced at the necklace.
Why give it to Amara?
She found the second mark without knowing it existed. She documented every step and left her repair visible. That made her your messenger? No. It made her an independent witness. Celeste had discovered the Origin collection 3 weeks earlier. 2 days later, she learned Northglass intended to acquire the workshop. The collection uses designs from my production cards, she said. Demolition could destroy the context proving when they were made. One decision profits from the archive. The other threatens it. You think I planned that? I don't need to. Your company scheduled both. You could move the records, not the fixed tools, material samples, or drawers with original labels. Provenance is more than paper.
And the necklace?
The oldest portable link in the chain. If this building became inaccessible, Amara could preserve it and explain it. Gideon expected money, shares, or a private apology, problems he knew how to send to lawyers. Celeste placed one typed page on the table. My terms are not a settlement. Northglass would suspend the collection launch. An independent specialist would examine both archives and publish the findings. Catalogs, exhibitions, and products would be corrected accordingly. Northglass would also withdraw its demolition filing and protect the workshop's lease and public programs during an independent community impact review. You want me to stop a national launch in 48 hours. I want you to stop selling authorship you haven't verified. What if some designs belong to Northglass? Then the record should say that. Our lawyers will demand confidentiality. No, an allegation before an audit could damage everyone. Which is why I prepared evidence, not an allegation. Retail contracts are signed. Employees depend on this. I know accountability has a cost. That doesn't mean the people who avoided it choose who keeps paying. Gideon lowered his voice. I could correct your credit privately and compensate you. If I wanted quiet payment, I would have called your attorney. The public record is wrong, and this building is called empty while people work here. He looked at Amara. What does she receive? Nothing from you for telling the truth, Celeste said. I meant housing, a position. You mean something that could make her report look purchased. Amara folded her arms. My work is not a bill you can settle. Gideon read the terms again. There was no request for personal access or forgiveness. Correcting the record would not restore their marriage. It would restore what the company had removed from her name. The launch is Friday at noon, Celeste said. The demolition authorization goes before the city that morning. You have 48 hours to suspend both and appoint the auditor. And if I don't, I submit Amara's report, my production records, and our legal correspondence to the permit board, retailers, and an independent provenance council. You kept the old letters? I kept everything, showing I objected before silence became convenient evidence that I agreed. That was what Gideon had feared. Celeste had named the erasure while he was still close enough to hear. He placed the page in his briefcase. I'll need to speak with the board. Decide what you will ask them to do. Celeste met his eyes without anger and without invitation. 48 hours. After that, the record moves without you. The next morning, Celeste's terms lay before Northglass's general counsel, Feinson's director, communications chief, and board chair. No one denied the collection resembled her necklace. They disagreed about what the resemblance required. The separation agreement gives Northglass broad rights to the founder archive, counsel said. Rights to the designs or credit for creating them? Gideon asked. Those are different questions. Then why do the booklets name me? The proof sheet carried Gideon's approval initials. The finance director listed retailer penalties, canceled advertising, finished inventory, and weeks of labor. Suspending the launch would hurt employees who knew nothing about Celeste's erased credit. That made the easier solution tempting. Council proposed buying the Juniper Street archive confidentially, compensating Celeste and crediting her in a future exhibition. And Amara. We could offer her a conservation position and relocation allowance, the communications chief said. Her report would become commissioned work and remain confidential during review. You want to buy the evidence and employ the witness. We want context before unverified claims circulate. Whose context? The company's. They were protecting hundreds of jobs, but asked people with the least power to trust those with the most. Gideon called Amara. A ventilation fan roared behind her. "You have 2 minutes. Northglass may offer you a conservation position and housing support. Would I keep the position if my report concludes the company covered Celeste's authorship?" Gideon looked around the table. "I don't know. Then it isn't a position, it's a condition. They would require confidentiality." "No, Amara. I completed my report before you entered the workshop. 14 pages, measurements, material comparisons, images, and chain of custody. Who has it? Celeste and I do. A sealed copy is ready for the municipal permit review. Why the permit review? The city file calls the workshop vacant and says no significant archive exists. Demolition threatens that archive. Both claims are false. When will you submit it?" "Friday morning. The same morning as the launch. The offer could give you stable housing," Gideon said. "I need housing. I won't trade the credibility of my work for it. If you appoint an independent auditor, I'll answer technical questions," Amara continued. "If you hire me because I'm useful but require me to become less believable,"
The answer is no.
The call ended. Council proposed delaying the permit hearing while proceeding with the launch. The finance director displayed 2 projections: the cost of suspension and the greater loss if the evidence became public first. Even accountability had become competing columns. Through the glass wall, Gideon saw early fixtures displayed beneath plaques bearing only his name. Employees carried boxes toward Friday's celebration. The board chair scheduled an emergency vote for 8:30 Friday morning. The demolition hearing would begin at 9. The collection would launch at noon. Council placed 2 statements before Gideon. One announced an internal review while business continued. It identified neither Celeste nor the evidence and kept control inside Northglass. The other suspended the collection, withdrew the demolition request, and appointed an independent audit. It admitted the company's historical attribution might be wrong.
Which one goes to the board with your recommendation?
Council asked. Amara had not asked him to repair her life. She had asked him not to damage her evidence. Send both. Without guidance, the board will choose the lower risk option. I know. Then what will you recommend? Gideon looked at the blank signature lines. For 20 years, he had signed whichever summary made the next decision easier. This time, every easy decision required someone else to carry the risk. He put both statements in his briefcase. I'll tell them Friday morning. At 8:30 Friday morning, the Northglass board asked for Gideon's recommendation. He opened the Origin collection booklet to the page naming him as its creative source. This attribution was never verified, he said. I approved it anyway. I also approved a report calling an active workshop vacant. Both decisions carry my initials. He placed the second statement on the table. I recommend suspending the launch, withdrawing the demolition filing, and appointing an independent audit authorized to publish its findings. A board member asked whether he accepted the financial and personal consequences. Yes, the vote was not unanimous, but it passed. At 8:52, Northglass notified retailers that the collection would not launch. 4 minutes later, Gideon withdrew the demolition request. At 9, Amara submitted her report to correct the municipal record. She identified herself only as the conservator who examined the necklace. Using photographs, she explained the saucer layers, oxidation, supplier batch number, and Celeste's maker's mark. She connected the object to dated production cards and fixed tools inside Juniper Street. Her language remained careful. No single mark proved authorship. Together, the records formed a chain requiring independent review. The city corrected the workshop's status from vacant to active community and training use. Amara's report entered the record under her own name. Gideon's authority had stopped the launch. Amara's knowledge established why it needed to stop. The audit lasted 7 weeks. Its specialist examined both archives, contracts, samples, catalog proofs, and separation correspondence. Gideon granted access without confidentiality conditions. Amara answered technical questions at the same rate paid to other conservators, with no job offer attached. Of 34 works credited to Gideon as Northglass's foundational designer, 27 originated in Celeste's records, 5 were documented collaborations. 2 remained uncertain. The inventory stamps did not prove a planned attempt to hide her marks. They revealed a careless system that repeatedly placed the company identifier over the makers beneath it. The separation agreement transferred ownership rights. It did not transfer authorship. Northglass replaced its exhibition plaques and removed Gideon's sole designer credit. Corrected entries named Celeste as designer, Gideon as commercial co-founder, or both where the evidence supported collaboration. Gideon explained the findings to employees and retailers. He named the decisions he had approved and did not blame former counsel, marketing staff, or time. Celeste refused a photograph with him beside the corrected archive. "This is attribution," she said. "Do not package it as reconciliation." "I won't." Her nod recognized the correction, not forgiveness. Amara checked every corrected description. One new line read, "Technical Provenance Analysis by Amara Ellis." Northglass suggested adding language about her courage and the opportunity the company hoped to provide. She removed it. The work is enough. One problem remained: withdrawing demolition protected Juniper Street only while Northglass controlled the purchase option. The owner could sell when that option expired. Celeste refused to let the workshop's up depend on Gideon's continued goodwill. The proposed solution was a community-controlled trust funded by corrected royalties and Northglass's relinquished acquisition deposit. It would hold a long-term lease and place future decisions in the hands of apprentices, instructors, and program users. Northglass agreed that its contribution would purchase no control, praise, or silence. Gideon signed a personal acknowledgement after reading every line himself. Celeste signed the trust documents. Amara signs as the archive's technical custodian. Only the building owner's approval remained. Without that final signature, the record had been corrected, but the place preserving it could still be lost. The building owner signed before Northglass's option expired. Preservation conditions had made demolition less attractive, while the community trust offered reliable funding. Juniper Street received a 15-year renewable lease. 5 months later, repairs were complete, and the benches remained under community control. Corrected royalties from Celeste's, designs funded material grants, and 3 apprenticeships each year. Northglass could contribute money, but held no seat on the trust. The corrected catalog named Celeste as designer and fabricator of the early wall fixture. Gideon was credited for commercial development and sales. Celeste read the entry, closed the catalog, and returned to teaching. Restored credit did not require her to perform gratitude. Northglass's archive now answered to an independent provenance committee and public audit. Gideon visited only when invited and waited at the door for permission to enter the archive. Amara earned a regional conservation apprenticeship through her portfolio, Celeste's recommendation, and the technical report submitted under her own name. The program included a small apartment above its laboratory. The housing was not Gideon's gift. It required no silence or gratitude. A room with her own lock still felt unfamiliar. For a week, Amara kept her overnight bag packed by the door. Then she put her clothes in the dresser and hung the empty bag in the closet. She continued working at Juniper Street as the Trust's archive custodian. Celeste discussed royalties and audits with Gideon, but declined both personal invitations. Responsibility did not buy closeness. For the corrected exhibition, Amara placed the necklace beneath the same yellow lamp where Gideon had recognized it. Celeste's faint initials remained beneath the deeper Northglass stamp. Gideon's pale solder crossed the old clasp. Amara's silver repair secured the bezel. A Northglass curator asked whether the new seam could be polished so the necklace would look consistent in the catalog. Amara shook her head. Consistency is what hid the first mark. She photographed the front, clasp, initials, and every solder layer. The record named Celeste as original designer and maker. It listed Gideon's early repair with an approximate date. Then Amara added her own name, repair method, and completion date. She did not claim equal authorship. She did not erase Gideon's contribution because he later failed to protect Celeste's. She recorded what each person had done. Celeste studied the image. You left the seam. It belongs to the object now. So does your name. The necklace was displayed at Juniper Street, not in the Northglass lobby. Apprentices could study its joints. Visitors could read its provenance, and the production cards remained nearby in protected storage. Gideon attended the opening by invitation and stood at the back. Celeste spoke with young metalsmiths while Amara explained why repair marks should be documented rather than disguised. No one announced a reconciliation. The outcome was quieter: a corrected name, a protected workshop, an earned apprenticeship, and a man learning that responsibility did not make him the center of the repair. Before closing, Amara returned the necklace to its case. Under the warm light, the visible seam did not resemble a flaw. It showed that something damaged had been repaired without lying about where it broke. Honest restoration preserves more than an object. It records the original maker, the people responsible for its history, and the hands that repaired it with care. If stories about the people hidden behind the work matter to you, subscribe to Hush Stories.